At the heart of the ancient world, on the wide and dusty plains of Mesopotamia, stood a city unlike any other. Its bricks were baked in fire, its temples reached toward the clouds, and its name would echo through history as the birthplace of confusion itself. This is the story of Babel. But it is not just a story of one tower. It is the story of human ambition, of language, of memory, and myth, all tangled together in one of the oldest cautionary tales we have. For centuries, scholars, pilgrims, and dreamers have tried to uncover what really happened in that distant land of Shinar. Was there truly a tower? If so, who built it? And why did so many ancient cultures seem obsessed with stories of rising too high and being cast back down? Tonight we are going to explore every layer of this story, from the mud brick foundations of Babylon to the whispered prayers of ancient priests, from the earliest myths of Sumer to the frescoes of the Renaissance. We will trace the legend through archaeology, history, religion, and linguistics. There is a lot more here than a few lines in Genesis. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Whether you're here to unwind, to learn something new, or to drift off while traveling through the past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. If you close your eyes and try to picture the world of the Tower of Babel, it helps to start not with a tower at all, but with a flat and shimmering plain. The land we call Mesopotamia, the ancient world between the Tigris and Euphrates, is not dramatic in the way of mountain ranges or deserts. It is a place of long horizons, of riverbanks and marshes, of mud and reeds and heat that presses down like a hand. For the people who lived there, the landscape was both generous and threatening. The rivers brought water and rich silt. They also brought floods that could erase a village in one dark night. In the biblical story, this wide river plain appears under another name. It is the land of Shinar. That word has the faint sound of something half remembered, as if preserved from a language that has long since gone quiet. For the writers of Genesis, Shinar was an almost shorthand way of saying the world of Babylon and its neighbors. It was the place where cities rose out of the mud and where human beings decided that stone and baked clay could raise them closer to the heavens. The story as we have it opens with an arresting claim. The whole earth, we are told, had one language and the same words. It is a simple sentence, but it carries a lot of weight. It suggests, first of all, a human family that is not yet divided into tribes and nations. No confusion of dialects, no need for interpreters. Everyone can speak to everyone else. No one has an accent that marks them as foreign. Whatever else the story will do with this, it begins from a picture of remarkable unity. Historically, of course, the world of early Mesopotamia was nothing so neat. If we could travel back to the 3rd millennium before Christ and sit in a market stall in Uruk or Ur, we would hear a lively tangle of tongues. Sumerian, with its clipped and complex sounds, Akkadian, with its relative softness, perhaps the speech of traders from further west along the Levantine coast. The clay tablets that have survived tell us clearly that people in this region wrote in more than one language. Yet the storytellers of Israel chose to frame things differently. From their perspective, looking back through layers of tradition, the first part of human history could be imagined as an era before division, before the great sorting of peoples. There is a kind of wistfulness in that notion. Anyone who has struggled with a phrase book in a foreign city knows the appeal of a world where everyone understands you. At the same time, the story hints that such simplicity might also be dangerous. A single language means that a single project can capture everyone at once. One idea, good or bad, can sweep through the whole community without resistance. The narrative sets us up to watch what happens when this unified humanity decides to build. To appreciate how that choice would have sounded to the first hearers of the story, we have to spend some time on that plain of Shinar and the cities that sprouted along its rivers. Mesopotamia is one of the earliest places on Earth where villages became towns and towns swelled into cities. In places like Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur, people gradually swapped a life of small farming in scattered hamlets for life inside crowded walls. There they dug canals, laid out streets, built temples at the center of their settlements, and turned mud into architecture. Mud was, in fact, the raw material of everything. There are no good quarries in southern Mesopotamia. If you wanted to build a wall, you took river mud, shaped it into bricks, dried them in the sun, or fired them in kilns. If you wanted a strong bond, you used bitumen, the thick, black, natural tar that seeped out of the ground in a few lucky places. The Bible gives an unusually precise detail on this point when it notes that the builders used brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Someone who knew the region had clearly left a fingerprint there. The result of all this was not only physical construction, but also a new way of seeing the world. A city is not just a cluster of houses, it is an idea. It says that people can cooperate on a scale that no single family could manage. It says that labor can be organized, that food can be stored, that specialized crafts can be supported. The rise of cities called forth new roles. Priests to tend the temples, scribes to keep accounts, officials to direct the flow of grain and labor. From the fragments of clay that archaeologists have unearthed, we can read the earliest writings of these scribes. Many of the tablets are not thrilling. They record deliveries of barley, lists of workers, allotments of beer. But even these dull records are part of a quiet revolution. Writing itself was born out of this urge to manage a growing urban world. When the biblical story speaks of one language, it speaks to both speech and script. The same words would have looked the same on clay and sounded the same when spoken aloud. Above the low roofs and courtyards of those cities rose structures that were neither palaces nor houses. They were temples built on high platforms. Over generations, as one platform was rebuilt on another, these temples grew into stepped pyramids that the people of Mesopotamia called ziggurats. Their purpose was religious, but their effect on the imagination was wider. A ziggurat stood there as a visible sign that humans could heap up the earth itself and make a staircase toward the sky. We are not yet at the Tower of Babel, but you can feel the atmosphere in which that story makes sense. Imagine being a shepherd from a nearby village, bringing animals to market in a great city for the first time. You walk through the gate, past walls that seem impossibly high. You see the ziggurat in the distance, its terraces rising one above another, painted, perhaps, in bright colors, with a small shrine glittering at the top. You have lived your whole life on flat ground. Nothing in your world reached higher than a date palm. Now there is this mountain of brick, placed exactly where the people of the city want it. For urban dwellers, especially those who lived close to the temple, this site would have become almost ordinary. The ziggurat was not just decoration, it was the ladder between earth and heaven, the axis that joined humans and gods. Rituals would be staged on its steps. Priests would ascend and descend. Offerings burned below and above. To participate in city life was, in part, to accept this vertical vision of the world, where the divine sits literally above you, reached by a carefully constructed way. When the authors of Genesis set their story in the plain of Shinar and have the people say, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens," they are speaking in this idiom. They assume a listener who knows what it means to see a tower pierce the line of the horizon. They assume a listener who understands that a city is more than houses, that it is a system that binds people together under a common project. The story treats the builders not as simple villagers, but as people who already live in the world that cities have created. There is another aspect of this world that matters for our story, and that is the way power worked. In Mesopotamian cities, kingship was closely tied to the gods. The ruler was not divine, at least not in the way an Egyptian pharaoh was thought to be, but he ruled as the chosen steward of the city god. Temple and palace often stood near each other, and projects were justified in religious language. When a king boasted about the walls he had built or the temples he had restored, he did so as someone fulfilling a divine commission. The Bible, speaking from outside that system, often looks at this union of political power and religious ambition with a wary eye. Later stories about Babylon, especially in the prophetic writings, present it as a symbol of arrogance, of a city that glorifies itself and forgets justice. Those later judgments hover just out of sight when we read about the city and tower of Genesis 11. The concern is not technology or architecture in themselves. It is what happens when a culture decides to pour all its energy into making a name for itself. The glow of unity in that opening line about one language begins to look less innocent when we consider the social reality. A single speech community can allow extraordinary cooperation, but it also allows great pressure to conform. In a small village, there is only so much you can ask people to do. The fields must be tended, animals cared for, simple irrigation ditches kept clear. In a city, the demands can be enormous. Tens of thousands of bricks must be molded and fired. Stones and timber must be hauled from far away. Labor is lifted out of the ordinary cycle of subsistence and poured into monumental construction. The Tower of Babel story invites us to imagine the moment when that decision is made. People have settled in Shinar, the narrative says. They have discovered that the soil yields good clay and that bitumen sticks everything together. They have learned how to bake bricks and lay them in thick courses. And one day, perhaps in a gathering of elders, perhaps in a meeting of officials, someone says, "Come, let us start a project that will bind us together and make sure we are never scattered. A city and a tower, a pair of creations that will declare who we are." Notice how the fear of being scattered is present even before the divine response. The builders are not trying to conquer the world. They are trying to avoid being broken apart. In the biblical story, this reveals a mistrust of the original instruction to fill the earth. The divine intent was that humans should spread out, turn wilderness into habitation, carry their image-bearing capacities into every region. But people, as the story tells it, prefer safety. They prefer to huddle together where they feel strong. Historically, there is something very understandable in that. The wider world around Mesopotamia was not empty. It contained deserts with nomadic tribes, mountains with raiders, seas with storms and pirates. If you lived in a city like Babylon or its forerunners, you relied on the city walls, on alliances, on the strength of numbers. The ambition to build a vast tower within your own secure walls could feel far wiser than sending your sons and daughters out into unknown lands. The city, in this sense, is both a shelter and a prison. It protects you, but it also keeps you under the shadow of its great projects and the will of those who direct them. At this point in the story, we have not yet heard the famous part. There is as yet no divine descent, no confusion of speech, no scattering. There is only a single human community on a river plain, a set of techniques for turning mud and tar into enduring structures, and a decision that everything they are will now be defined by a tower that touches the sky. Beneath that simple description lies an entire world of routines and hopes. Women grinding grain, children carrying water, foremen shouting instructions, scribes keeping count of bricks, priests blessing foundations, kings dreaming of their place in history. The remarkable thing about the Tower of Babel's story is how economically it gestures toward all this. It gives us only a few sentences, but behind them stands the enormous human experiment that was early urban civilization. When the people say, "Come, let us build," they are not inventing something from nothing. They are taking the logic of their world one step further. If irrigation canals and city walls and temple platforms are good, perhaps an even greater monument will be better. If the union of language and labor has already given them a measure of control over their environment, perhaps it can also secure them against loss and obscurity. This, then, is the stage on which the drama of Babel begins. The plain of Shinar, with its rivers, its reeds, and its long horizons. The early cities, humming with trade and prayer and fear. The ziggurats that already touch the sky in the minds of their builders, a single language that allows commands to travel swiftly from ruler to worker, from elder to youth. And in the midst of all this, a decision that will ripple out into legend, that will be told and retold as the moment when human beings reached for a unity that was both impressive and deeply flawed. For most of history, the Tower of Babel lived entirely in the imagination. People could read the story in Genesis and hear sermons about human pride and scattered tongues, but they had no clear idea where this tower might have stood, or even whether it had any anchor in real stone and clay. There was only a vague sense that somewhere out there, on the hot plains of Mesopotamia, the ruins of that great ambition still lay under the dust. The land between the rivers had become a kind of holy abstraction. It was the place of Eden, of Abraham, of the exile. The idea that one could walk among the broken bricks of the tower itself would have seemed a dream. The first clues did not come from archaeologists in the modern sense, but from ancient travelers who took careful note of what they saw. In the 5th century before Christ, a curious Greek named Herodotus visited Babylon. He wrote of the city with a mixture of awe and suspicion. To him, Babylon was enormous, its walls incredibly thick, its streets laid out in an orderly way, and at its religious heart stood a temple of the god he called Zeus Belus. 7 terraces climbed toward a shrine on top. Priests slept there, he reported, in a chamber reserved for the divine presence. Herodotus is not always a precise reporter, but his account left a lingering picture in the European mind of a Babylonian tower that reached boldly into the sky. The city that Herodotus saw did not last. Alexander the Great dreamed of making Babylon the capital of his empire, but he died there instead. Over the centuries that followed, the great temples and walls sank slowly back into the plain. Mud brick does not age gracefully. When the protection of baked brick facing falls away, rain and wind turn the inner mass back into soft clay. By the time medieval travelers approached the region, Babylon was no longer a living city but a series of mounds. Still, the ruins were impressive enough to stir both superstition and curiosity. Local people gave the mounds names that drew on older legends. One of the most striking heaps of brick south of Baghdad, with a jagged lump of brickwork rising above its sloping sides, became known to outsiders as Beers Nimrud. The name linked the ruin with Nimrod, the mighty hunter of Genesis, who later tradition cast as a proud king associated with Babel. Pilgrims and early European visitors were only too happy to accept the identification. Here, they said, is the tower that defied heaven. In religious prints of the 17th and 18th centuries, engravers confidently labeled sketches of the ruin as the Tower of Babel. What they were actually looking at was the ruined ziggurat of the ancient city of Borsippa, not far from Babylon itself. That structure had once been a massive stepped pyramid dedicated to the god Nabu. Its baked brick core still jutted from the top of the mound like the broken stump of a tooth. In the 19th century, long before systematic excavations, travelers described it with a mixture of wonder and gloom. One English visitor remarked, on the way burnt bricks with unknown inscriptions lay scattered at his feet, some fused with a glassy sheen, as if fire had raged through the tower. To a mind steeped in the biblical story, this looked like confirmation. A tower, a ruin, the memory of divine judgment. What more could one need? The answer, as it turned out, was patient work with shovels and an ability to read the strange wedge-shaped signs on those bricks. In the early decades of the 19th century, Europeans began to take a more systematic interest in the ancient Near East. Expeditions set out from London and Paris, their leaders usually soldiers or diplomats with a taste for adventure and a supply of sketchbooks. They traveled up the rivers by boat or across the desert by caravan, endured fever and heat, bargained with local authorities, and stared at the mysterious mounds that dotted the horizon. Somewhere under those low hills, they knew, lay the cities of biblical and classical fame. One of the great breakthroughs came not on the ground, but on the surface of towering cliffs. In what is now Iran, on a rock face at Behistun, a Persian king named Darius had commissioned a monumental inscription centuries earlier. It was written in 3 languages, all in the wedge-shaped script we now call cuneiform. An officer named Henry Rawlinson risked his neck to copy the signs, clinging to the rock with ropes and stakes. With those copies in hand, scholars were eventually able to use the trilingual text as a key, just as the Rosetta Stone had been used to unlock Egyptian hieroglyphs. Letter by letter, word by word, the languages of ancient Mesopotamia began to give up their secrets. Attention began to shift to another mound closer to the modern town of Hilla. Here lay the true heart of Babylon. In the closing years of the 19th century, a German architect named Robert Koldewey undertook one of the most ambitious excavations of the age. He spent years on the site, living in a simple house near the ruins, supervising local workers, and carefully uncovering the lines of city walls, the processional way, the Ishtar Gate, and the remains of grand buildings described in texts. Among these were the foundations of a gigantic square platform of brick within the sacred precinct of the main temple of the god Marduk. The texts called this ziggurat Etemenanki, a Sumerian name that means House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. It is a remarkably evocative title. To the priests and citizens of Babylon, this was not just a tall building. It was the point where the axis of their world touched the sky. Clay tablets discovered elsewhere describe its dimensions. The base was a square, each side over 90 meters long. The tower rose in several stepped stages, probably 7, with a small shrine at the top. A later Babylonian text, known as the Esagila tablet, even provides rough measurements for each stage. Scholars argue about the exact height, but many think it may have reached about 90 meters, perhaps more. If so, it would have dominated the city and the flat countryside around it in a way that is hard for us to imagine. The identification of Etemenanki with the biblical tower is based on more than size and shape. Inscriptions from the time of King Nebuchadnezzar II speak directly about his work on this very tower. On one commemorative cylinder, he boasts that previous kings had neglected the ziggurat and left it a ruin, but he, with the favor of the great God, had seen fit to rebuild it from its foundations. He describes the bricks he had fired, the bitumen and cedar he had used, and the way he raised the summit to stand in pride over Babylon. There is a striking echo there of the phrase in Genesis about a tower with its top in the heavens. A stone object, sometimes called the Tower of Babel's Stele, now in a European museum, shows a king believed to be Nebuchadnezzar standing before a stepped tower. The image is small and stylized, but it captures the essential form of a ziggurat. To Egyptians, the iconic structure is the pyramid. To classical Greeks, it is the columned temple. To Babylonians, it was this man-made mountain, this ladder of terraces climbing from the earth to a divine seat. When people from later cultures heard about such a tower, it is not surprising that their imagination seized upon it. While archaeologists were uncovering brick after brick, philologists were working on the names. The Hebrew word Babel is used in Genesis both for the city and the tower. In other parts of the Bible, the same word stands for Babylon, which is how it is usually translated in English. In Akkadian, the language of Babylon, the city was called Bab-Ili or Bab-Ilani, usually rendered as Gate of the God or Gate of the Gods. That was a positive name. It suggested that the city was a doorway through which the divine presence entered the human realm. Hebrew storytellers heard that foreign name and reshaped it with a pun, linking Babel to their own verb balal, which means to confuse or mix. The city that claimed to be the gate of heaven became, in Israelite memory, the place of linguistic confusion. The more texts were translated, the more the world of Babylon began to look familiar in strange ways. There were flood stories on clay tablets that reminded scholars of Noah. There were law codes that sounded, in some respects, like early brothers of the commandments given to Moses. There were hymns and prayers that recorded ancient longings and fears. Within this wider tapestry, the ziggurat of Etemenanke stood out as a particularly vivid thread. It was at once an architectural marvel, a symbol of royal ambition, and a focal point of religious life. When later readers of Genesis imagined a single great tower on the plain of Shinar, this ziggurat would have been an obvious real-world model to draw on. It is worth picturing the scene when Koldewey and his workers finally traced the full outline of the tower foundations. Day after day, laborers dug through layers of rubble and drifted soil. They moved wheelbarrows of broken brick and powdered clay. Slowly, a coherent square platform emerged, its sides aligned with the cardinal points. The lines were crisp, the corners true. Here was no random heap of debris. This was the deliberate footprint of a colossal structure. Even in ruins, the thing had presence. To stand on that level ground and look up, knowing that once 7 bright terraces had risen above you, must have been a sobering experience. The realization that burst Nimrud was not the Tower of Babel, and that the true candidate lay at Babylon itself, did not erase the emotional power of the earlier identification. Generations of travelers had seen the Borsippa mound as a warning. Their notes and drawings formed part of the long history of how the West imagined the tower. Yet the correction mattered. It demonstrated that romance and tradition are not enough. To connect ancient stories with ancient places, one needs the stubborn details of inscriptions and the discipline to follow where they lead. Ziggurats themselves did not belong to Babylon alone. Throughout southern Mesopotamia, cities built these structures beside their temples. Ur had its towering platform dedicated to the moon god. Nippur had one for the great god Enlil. Each was a local version of the same idea. The gods were thought to dwell in the heavens, but their favor and attention could be drawn down to a particular place by giving them a raised residence. The ziggurat was rarely a place where ordinary people climbed. It was a ritual space for priests and select officials. The everyday worshippers gathered in courtyards below, under the shadow of the ascending terraces. This pattern matters when we think of the Tower of Babel story. The people in Genesis are not criticized for building tall structures as such. The problem lies in their intent. Come, they say. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower and make a name for ourselves so that we will not be scattered. A ziggurat, built as a house for a god, raised in humility as a place where heaven might graciously touch earth, is one thing. A tower raised for the sake of human reputation, designed to secure the builders against the future, is another. The biblical narrative takes a familiar piece of Mesopotamian architecture and turns it into a moral test. Modern excavations have not found a smoking gun that says, "Here is the exact moment when this tower was begun or halted." What they have found is a landscape filled with ziggurats in various stages of construction and decay, and a set of texts in which kings boast of their projects and confess, sometimes between the lines, their anxieties. Nebuchadnezzar, in his inscriptions, speaks often of permanence. He wants his name to be remembered forever, his works to stand for all time. Yet the archaeologist who reads those words does so while standing in the ruins of the very structures that were supposed to defeat time. That tension between the dream of endurance and the reality of collapse is at the heart of the Tower of Babel story and at the heart of the archaeological record. Bricks crumble, temples fall, languages change, yet the desire to build upward, to mark the landscape with something that says we were here, persists. Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, is only one instance of that impulse, but it is a particularly grand one. So by the time we reach the world of the biblical writers, there is a long history already in place. The plain of Shinar has seen city after city rise. Ziggurats have been built, repaired, and left to erode. Kings have stamped their names into bricks and sent their scribes to record their achievements. Travelers from distant lands have stared at the mounds and wondered what stories they conceal. When the tale of a single tower with its top in the heavens begins to circulate, it falls onto soil that has been prepared by centuries of real towers and real human projects. In this way, archaeology and text speak to one another across time. The archaeologist sees the layers in the earth. The reader of ancient writings follows layers of memory and interpretation. Both are trying to get at the same thing, which is not simply what stood where, but what it meant to the people who built it. When we look at the broken base of Etemenanki, we are not just looking at a massive engineering effort. We are looking at a people who believed that the distance between the earth and the sky could be narrowed by work, that a tower could become a kind of cosmic hinge. That belief did not disappear with Babylon. Similar ideas appear in other cultures, in other times, but in Mesopotamia the expression was particularly literal and physical. To climb a ziggurat was to enact, step by step, a journey toward the divine. To stand at its base and look up was to be reminded of how small one was. It is in the presence of such structures, both impressive and fragile, that the drama of Babel takes on its sharpest focus. If the Tower of Babel story were a tree, its roots would reach deep into the soil of a much older storytelling world. Long before anyone in Judah told the tale of a single language shattered into many, scribes in the cities of Sumer had been scratching their own dramas into wet clay. They wrote about kings who tried to stretch their influence across mountains, about gods who tinkered with human destiny, and about the strange, slippery thing we call language. To follow the story of Babel to its source, we have to sit for a while with those Sumerian tablets and listen to the voices that come through them. The story begins in a classroom. Not the kind with desks and fluorescent lights, but a low mud brick building known in Sumerian as the Eduba, the tablet house. Here, perhaps around the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ, a boy sits cross-legged on the floor with a fresh lump of clay in front of him. His teacher recites a line in Sumerian, that old language of city gods and temple hymns, and the boy tries to press it into the clay with a stylus. The script is cuneiform, wedge-shaped signs impressed with the cut end of a reed. At first he writes simple lists, grain, animals, numbers. Later, he will copy more elaborate texts, songs, laments, proverbs, and myths that reach back in time. The remarkable thing about this scene is that the boy is probably bilingual. Sumerian is already, in many cities, a learned language, the speech of ritual and scholarship. On the streets of places like Ur and Lagash, people are speaking Akkadian, a Semitic tongue related to later Hebrew and Arabic. In the tablet house, however, the old language rules. To become a scribe is to learn not only signs but also a culture that is already looking backward to its own golden age. When Sumerian scribes write about a time when the world was different, they are already thinking in layers, much as the later authors of Genesis will do. One of the most intriguing pieces that came out of these schools is a long story we now call Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. The text survives in several fragmentary copies discovered at different sites, which suggests it was copied and recopied for generations. In it, we meet a king of Uruk named Enmerkar, a figure who belongs to that hazy region between legend and history. Enmerkar wants to build up the goddess Inanna's temple in Uruk, and needs precious stones and metals from a distant land called Aratta. The problem is that the Lord of Aratta has his own ambitions, and is not keen to submit to Uruk. What follows is a kind of diplomatic drama in verse. Messengers hurry back and forth between the two cities, carrying ever more elaborate speeches. Enmerkar tries persuasion, then threat, then magic. The story is full of boastful claims about the greatness of Uruk and its god. But near the end we encounter a curious passage. The text tells how the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, once changed the speech of humans. The exact wording varies in the damaged tablets, but the gist is that there was a time when everyone worshipped Enlil, the chief god, with a single voice, and that Enki then altered the tongues of the people and scattered their speech. It is hard for a modern reader not to feel a jolt of recognition at that line. Here we have a Mesopotamian story that already links divine action with the disruption of a previous harmony of language. The motive in the Sumerian tale is not quite the same as in Genesis. Enki is a trickster, a god who likes to unsettle neat arrangements. Yet the idea that a god could reach into the human world by adjusting human speech is already in circulation. The later Babel story will take this idea and use it in a different context. But we can see the earlier pattern. Language is not simply a tool. It is one of the levers by which the gods shape history. Another early composition that brushes up against our subject is what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian account of creation and flood. This text, also reconstructed from damaged fragments, tells how the gods created humans, founded cities, and eventually grew angry enough to send a great flood. In one section, there are hints that before the flood, humans shared a common mode of speech and a simple, peaceful way of life, which was then disrupted by divine decision. The parallels with later biblical traditions about a pre-flood world followed by a judgment are suggestive. Again, we see the pattern of unity, then divine intervention, then dispersion. These Sumerian narratives did not come with subtitles explaining their connection to later stories. They sat in archives for centuries, then lay buried for millennia. When 19th century scholars began to translate them, they were startled to find familiar themes. A wise god warns one man of an approaching flood and instructs him to build a large boat. A king tries to extend his power by sending messengers over distant mountains. A god reshapes human language. None of these is identical to the plot of the Tower of Babel, but the family resemblance is strong. What matters for our purposes is not the question of who copied whom, but the cultural atmosphere these texts represent. The people of Sumer and later Babylonia lived in a landscape where many dialects and languages rubbed shoulders. Merchants from Elam in the east, traders from the Levant in the west, mountain peoples from the north, all came and went. The scribes who trained in the tablet houses were acutely aware of different tongues. They produced long lexical lists that lined up Sumerian words with Akkadian equivalents and, in later times, even with other languages. These lists functioned as glossaries and perhaps as teaching aids. To compile such a list, you have to pay attention to what people call things in different languages. You have to accept that the world is not bound to a single set of names. There is a quiet cosmopolitanism in that work. The Tower of Babel story, told much later, imagines an earlier time when that multiplicity did not exist. It is as if the biblical authors took the scribes' awareness of many tongues and turned it backward into an origin tale. Once, they say, there was no need for lexical lists. The notes of explanation in the margins of clay and parchment become, in retrospect, the scars of a divine intervention. The Sumerians also had a profound sense of the power of spoken words. Many of their surviving texts are incantations. These are not stories in the usual sense, but compact rituals meant to be recited aloud in precise form. A cure for a headache might involve a description of a mythic scene in which a demon is driven out, followed by a fixed phrase that the sufferer or priest must speak. The effect was not in the narrative content, but in the exact wording and delivery. To say the words incorrectly was to risk leaving the demon untouched. Words were not simply descriptive, they were active. In this environment, it is not surprising that language would become a subject of myth itself. If speech has power, then the god who controls speech has enormous influence. Enki, as lord of wisdom and trickery, is a natural candidate. In the story of Inanna and Enki, for example, the goddess visits his city and gets him drunk. While he is in his cups, she persuades him to hand over the me, divine decrees that cover everything from kingship to music. The me are not just laws, but patterns for all aspects of culture. Once Inanna carries them off to Uruk, that city becomes the new center of civilization. Language is not the focus here, but the idea that cultural powers can be moved and redistributed is key. The Enmerkar story adds a twist to this. There, the question is not only which city holds which divine privileges, but how people in different lands can communicate. At one point, the overburdened messenger complains about the length of the speeches he has to carry, and the narrative introduces an incantation about the tongue of Sumer, of the foreign lands, of the people. The divine adjustment of language that follows is both a disruption and, in some interpretations, a way of simplifying things. Scholars still argue about whether the text describes the creation of diverse tongues or their unification. The ambiguity itself is revealing. What we see in these myths is a recognition that language is both a bridge and a barrier. It links cities and courts when it works, and isolates them when it breaks. It allows kings to send commands and traders to strike bargains, but it can also sow confusion that has real political consequences. A misunderstood message between Uruk and Aratta could mean war instead of alliance. In a world without radio or reliable writing among the common people, the clarity of spoken words matters enormously. When later Israelite scribes sat in Babylon during the exile, they would have encountered a city that was heir to all these stories. Babylon in the 6th century before Christ was a multilingual empire. Akkadian still echoed in ritual and law, but Aramaic was the lingua franca of trade and day-to-day administration. Hebrew-speaking deportees from Judah had to learn new scripts and phrases just to function. In that setting, the idea of a time when everyone spoke the same language would have had a certain nostalgic charm. It would also have raised hard questions about power. Whose language would that single tongue be? The Babel account answers that question indirectly. The people in Genesis speak of making a name for themselves. They want to ensure that their identity, condensed into a name and a language, is preserved. The scattering of tongues that follows is a judgment on that desire for domination, but it is also, in a strange way, a protection. It prevents one culture from swallowing all others. The Sumerian myths, by contrast, accept the competition between cities as a basic condition of life. Uruk gains this divine favor. Nippur holds that one. Babylon later claims to be the gate of the gods. Language is one more field in this jostling. It is possible that fragments of the Enmerkar story or related traditions floated around the ancient Near East long after they were no longer copied in Sumerian schools. Oral tales travel in ways that written texts do not. An Israelite merchant in a caravanserai might have heard a Babylonian trader mention that once, long ago, the God of wisdom changed human speech, and that is why people in the mountains talk strangely. Such stories can linger in fragments in popular memory, even when scholars forget the original full texts. By the time the authors of Genesis shaped their own account of a tower and confused tongues, they were working in an environment where these themes had a long pedigree. Another way to see the connection is through geography. Many of the Sumerian myths locate important events in cities that later became symbolic in Israelite thought. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and Babylon were not imaginary places. They were known centers of religion and power. When the Genesis story speaks of Shinar and of a city founder named Nimrod, whose kingdom includes Babel, Erech, and Akkad, it is drawing on a remembered map of the region. Nimrod is a legendary figure, but the list of cities under his sway reads like a roster of Sumerian and Akkadian centers. Somewhere in that remembered geography, tales of language and pride had been told long before. The question of influence is always delicate. It is tempting to draw straight lines from one story to another, to say that the Sumerian Enmerkar tale became the Israelite Babel tale with only a change of names. Real history is rarely that tidy. Cultural exchange is more like a slow seep through cracked walls than a single bold theft. What we can say with some confidence is that the basic motifs of the Babel story, a unified human language, a great urban building project, divine concern about human ambition, and the scattering of peoples through an act that affects their speech, all have close cousins in earlier Mesopotamian literature. Seen in this light, The Tower of Babel becomes part of a long conversation about what cities and languages do to us. The Sumerian side of that conversation is often playful and sharp. The god Enki tricks, the goddess Inanna schemes, the kings boast. Language is a field where wit and power intersect. To compose a good incantation is to wield magic. To phrase a royal inscription well is to polish one's image in clay for future ages. To misspeak in a diplomatic embassy is to risk disaster. We might imagine a Sumerian scribe and a later Israelite scribe, separated by centuries, sitting across an invisible table from each other. The Sumerian says, "The gods once changed our tongues because they were restless and wanted to stir the pot." The Israelite replies, "The one God changed tongues because human pride had turned unity into a tool of control." Both agree that the babel of languages is not an accident. It is a story that has to be told, a puzzle that has to be explained. Modern readers, living in a world where linguistics is a science, and where we can trace the evolution of languages through shared sound shifts and grammar, may smile at these stories. We know that languages split and merge over centuries through migration, conquest, and slow change, not through a single thunderclap event at a tower. Yet even now, the intuition that speech is central to identity remains. When a government chooses one official language over others, it shapes the lives of citizens. When parents speak one language at home and their children answer in another, they feel the tug of competing worlds. The ancient myths of Sumer capture that tension in a way that is surprisingly fresh. Beneath their references to gods and magical objects, they are grappling with a basic fact of human experience. We are creatures who depend on words, yet no word is permanent. Sounds wear down, meanings drift, scripts change, and with them the sense of who we are. The Tower of Babel story will frame this as an act of divine mercy and judgment combined. The Sumerian stories frame it as part of the ceaseless play of divine politics. Both approaches recognize that language is never neutral. By the time the Babel narrative takes its familiar form, the world it describes has already lived through centuries of reflection on these themes. The Sumerian legends give us a glimpse of that earlier reflection. They show a civilization that saw itself as always on the verge of losing or gaining the favor of the gods, and that understood language as one of the main arenas where that favor could be expressed. The clay tablets that carry those tales are small, fragile objects. Many are broken, many lines are lost. Yet, from their fragments, we can piece together a prehistory of Babel, a background hum of stories in which tongues are adjusted, cities vie for supremacy, and the gods look on with amused or anxious interest. When people today talk about the Tower of Babel, whether they picture a spiraling ziggurat or a crumbling mass of bricks in a storm, they are usually thinking of a few short lines near the beginning of Genesis. The whole episode, city and tower and scattering, fits into a passage that could be read aloud in a couple of minutes. Yet those minutes have generated centuries of commentary, embellishment, and debate. To understand how this compact story grew into something so large in the imagination, we need to look first at the way it sits inside Genesis, and then at the way later writers, beginning with Jewish historians like Josephus, could not resist filling in all the gaps. In the Hebrew text, The Babel story appears in the 11th chapter of Genesis, immediately after the long list of nations that descends from Noah, and just before the call of Abram. It is a hinge. On one side is the saga of humanity in general, with great arcs of creation, flood, and light sketched across the canvas. On the other side is the more focused story of a single family, that of Abram, later Abraham, through whom blessing will come to the nations. Babel is the last collective act in which humanity appears as a single character. After this, people are divided, not only by land and language, but by the distinct histories of their clans. The story begins quietly enough. The whole earth had one language and the same words. People migrate from the east and settle in the land of Shinar, that familiar biblical name for the flat river plain of Mesopotamia. The first thing they do is technological. They say to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them." The narrator pauses to explain that they use brick instead of stone and bitumen instead of mortar, a detail that catches exactly the practice of the cities on that plain. Then comes the turn. "Come," they say, "let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, or we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Already there is more going on here than a straightforward condemnation of architecture. The tower does not stand alone. It is part of a city, and the city in turn is a way to hold people together. The fear of being scattered is explicit. These builders want continuity and control. In a world where floods and invasions can erase settlements in a season, that is understandable. Yet the phrase, "let us make a name for ourselves," has an edge to it. In the world of the Hebrew Bible, a name is not only a label, it is wrapped up with reputation, authority, and even destiny. To make a name for oneself is to seize the power to define who you are, rather than receiving that definition from God. The narrative then shifts scenes in a way that has amused and troubled readers for centuries. We are told that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. It is almost playful. The tower that is supposed to reach into heaven is, from the divine perspective, a little project that must be inspected at close range. The divine verdict is subtle. God does not say that tall towers are evil. Instead, the concern is that this unified humanity, with one language and one project, will now be able to carry through whatever schemes it dreams up. Nothing that they propose to do will now be out of reach, the text says. In response, the decision is made to confound their language so that they will not understand one another. The work on the tower halts. The city is left unfinished. People scatter from there over the face of the earth, and their place receives the name Babel, because there their speech was confused. The story accomplishes two things at once. It explains why there are so many different languages in the world, and it brings the human story to a point where the call of a single man, Abram, can be presented as a new beginning. Modern scholars have spent a great deal of effort trying to understand how this story came to be shaped in this way. Many think that it took its final form during or after the Babylonian exile, when scribes from Judah were living in a city dominated by a real temple tower, a ziggurat that claimed to join heaven and earth. The name Babel in the text is the same as the Hebrew word for Babylon. For people whose capital, Jerusalem, had been destroyed by Babylonian troops, the memory of that city would have been complicated. It was a place of cultural advancement and deep humiliation. To tell a story in which Babylon is portrayed as the site of frustrated human pride would have had a certain satisfaction. At the same time, the writers of Genesis do something more interesting than simple revenge. The punishment at Babel is not destruction by fire or flood. It is the introduction of diversity. Human language is fractured and people are scattered, but they also go out to fill the earth as earlier commanded. In the larger sweep of Genesis, the very scattering that the builders feared becomes the condition under which God will later call Abraham and promise that through his descendants all these nations will be blessed. The story of Babel is stern, but it is not entirely bleak. The spare quality of the narrative invited elaboration almost immediately. Later Jewish traditions, preserved in writings outside the Hebrew Bible, return again and again to the question of motive and the character of the builders. One of the earliest and most influential of these retellings appears in the work of the Jewish historian we know today as Flavius Josephus. Josephus was born in Jerusalem in the 1st century of our era, into a priestly family. He received a careful education in Jewish law and tradition, but he also moved in circles that were aware of Greek thought and Roman politics. When a revolt broke out in Judea against Roman rule, Josephus first joined the rebel side. Then, after his capture, shifted his allegiance to the Roman general who would become the Emperor Vespasian. It was not a simple life, and his reputation has never entirely escaped the charge of opportunism. Yet in his later years, living under Roman patronage, he wrote long accounts of Jewish history in Greek, partly to explain his people to the wider world. In his work titled Jewish Antiquities, Josephus retells the stories of Genesis with a great many extra details. When he comes to the Tower of Babel, he introduces a character who barely appears in the biblical text, the mighty hunter Nimrod. In Genesis, Nimrod is a shadowy figure mentioned in a genealogical list, a descendant of Ham whose kingdom includes Babel and other Mesopotamian cities. Josephus takes this thread and pulls it into a full portrait. Nimrod becomes a tyrant who persuades people to place their trust in him instead of in God. He encourages them to think that their own strength and numbers are enough to secure their future. Josephus describes Nimrod as someone who feared that another flood might come, and who therefore resolved to build a tower so tall that no flood could reach the top. The tower is both a monument to his pride and a practical scheme to defy any future judgment. In this version, the tower is not simply a cultural project that goes too far. It is an explicit act of rebellion. Nimrod is said to have stirred the people up with speeches, telling them that God sought to keep them in fear and that they should instead rely on their own courage and skill. The tower is, in modern terms, a propaganda project. For a writer like Josephus, accustomed to Roman histories full of speeches put into the mouths of emperors and generals, this kind of elaboration felt natural. He turns the bare biblical lines into something like a political case study. The people are not just nameless workers, but a crowd led by an ambitious ruler. The problem is no longer only the idea of a united humanity with dangerous potential. It is the specific abuse of that unity by a man who wants to make himself central. Josephus also adds touches that underline the severity of the divine response. In his telling, when God confuses their speech, the builders not only fail to understand one another, but fall into conflict. Some, he says, are struck by lightning. Others perish in the ruins of the tower as it is shaken. The scattering is chaotic and violent. It is not just a gentle pushing outward. It is a collapse that leaves lasting trauma. Why did Josephus tell the story this way? Part of the answer lies in his audience. He was writing for readers steeped in Greek and Roman literature, readers who expected moral lessons wrapped in vivid scenes. A simple mention that God confused human language would have seemed thin. By introducing Nimrod as an example of bad leadership and depicting the tower as the fruit of his arrogance, Josephus offers a cautionary tale about the danger of kings who exalt themselves. His own memories of the fall of Jerusalem, of failed leaders and ruined cities, must have been close at hand as he wrote. Josephus was not the only one to expand the story. Another early Jewish work, the Book of Jubilees, probably composed a century or two before Josephus, also lingers on Babel. Jubilees is a rewriting of Genesis and part of Exodus that arranges the narrative in a strict chronological framework of weeks and jubilees. In its retelling, the building of the tower begins a certain number of years after the flood. Nimrod appears again as a central figure. The text gives the height of the tower, reports how long the construction took, and even mentions that 3 groups of builders had different motives. Some wanted to live together in the tower, some wanted to place an idol on its top, and some wanted to storm heaven itself. God responds by sending a great wind that overturns the tower, and by creating 70 languages, which become the tongues of 70 nations. These details were not drawn from archaeology. They were the work of imagination and reflection. They reveal what aspects of the story troubled and fascinated the communities that preserved them. The 3 kinds of motive, for example, allowed Jubilees to explore different shades of defiance, from the desire for security to idolatry, to outright assault on the divine realm. The fixed number of languages, 70, becomes a neat way to map the variety of human cultures onto a divinely ordered list. For readers who lived in a world where Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and other tongues jostled together in markets and streets, such structuring of diversity was comforting. In later centuries, rabbinic teachers continued this process of elaboration in the form of midrash, interpretive tales that adorn the biblical text. One well-known tradition imagines that during the building of the tower, a brick was considered more valuable than a human life. If a worker fell to his death, people shrugged and carried on. But if a brick slipped and broke, there was mourning for the lost material. It is a dark little scene, intended to show how the project had twisted values. The tower, in this telling, has become a machine that consumes people. Another midrashic strand suggests that the builders wanted to install swords or idols at the top of the tower in order to challenge God directly. Some versions say they planned to climb up and start a war. Others say they intended to take control of the rains by building reservoirs in the sky. In each case, the builders are no longer simply fearful of scattering. They are plotting a kind of cosmic coup. These stories may sound extravagant, but they are attempts to read Genesis as a living word, to ask what sort of inner attitude could lie behind the simple phrase, "Let us make a name for ourselves." Early Christian interpreters inherited this rich Jewish tapestry and added their own threads. Church fathers such as Augustine considered Babel in the context of their broader reflections on the city of God and the city of man. For Augustine, the tower symbolized a human society organized around self-love and pride, in contrast to a community ordered by love of God. The confusion of languages became an emblem of the way pride fragments human relationships. At the same time, Christian readers often linked Babel with the story of Pentecost in the book of Acts, in which the disciples of Jesus are said to speak in many tongues and be understood by people from diverse regions. For them, Pentecost was a kind of healing of Babel, not by returning to one language, but by the miracle of mutual understanding amid diversity. It is easy to see, even from this brief survey, how the simple narrative in Genesis could not contain the curiosity it provoked. Every generation asked new questions. Who led the project? How did ordinary workers feel? What exactly did God do to their speech? Did the languages change all at once, or gradually? Were there 70 languages, or 72? Was Hebrew preserved as the original sacred tongue, or was it one more fragment created at Babel? Rabbis and scholars argued about these points with considerable passion. One persistent theme in Jewish tradition was the status of Hebrew. Many sages held that Hebrew was the language God used to create the world, the language in which he spoke to Adam, Noah, and Abraham. In that view, Hebrew existed before Babel and continued after it, preserved among the descendants of Shem, while other peoples received new tongues. Others were less sure. Some medieval thinkers suggested that even the speech of Adam had been changed after the fall, and again after Babel. Underneath these disputes lay a longing for an unbroken word, a language that would not shift and twist under the pressures of time. Josephus, writing in Greek, was somewhat more practical. His concern was not to secure the prestige of Hebrew, but to explain Jewish traditions in terms that educated Greeks and Romans could understand. He adopts the standard Greek practice of embedding speeches in his narrative. He casts Nimrod as a familiar type, the arrogant monarch whose pride draws disaster on his people. In doing so, he stretches a short biblical story into an episode that can stand alongside the fall of other hubristic rulers in classical literature. There is a certain irony in the fact that the story of the confusion of languages itself was transmitted and expanded in many languages. The Hebrew of Genesis, the Aramaic paraphrases used in synagogues, the Greek of the Septuagint and of Josephus, the Latin of Jerome and Augustine, the later Arabic accounts in Islamic literature, all carried the Babel story into new cultural worlds. Each time it crossed a linguistic border, it picked up accents and emphases from its new home. The very process of retelling became a kind of living echo of the event it described. By the time the tale reaches Josephus and his contemporaries, Babel is no longer only an ancient Mesopotamian construction site. It is a mirror in which each age sees its own dangers. For readers in the Roman world, it could stand for the arrogance of emperors who tried to set themselves above the limits of mortality. For exiled Jews far from their homeland, it could stand for the imperial projects that crushed the poor and turned human lives into bricks in someone else's project. For philosophers, it was a way to talk about the limits of human knowledge and the inevitable failure of attempts to build a completely unified society. In this sense, The Tower of Babel is one of those stories that keeps generating meaning because it never specifies more than it has to. The text in Genesis does not tell us what the tower looked like, how high it was, or exactly how the builders felt when they realized they no longer understood one another. It focuses on a few key ideas: unity, ambition, fear of scattering, and divine concern. That very restraint makes it possible for later writers to imagine the missing details in ways that speak to their own times. When Josephus sits in Rome and writes about Nimrod, he is not simply looking back at a distant past. He is thinking about leadership, power, and the tragedies he has witnessed. When a rabbi in a Galilean village tells his students that the builders of the tower cared more about bricks than about human life, he is not only talking about Shinar, he is talking about any society that sacrifices people to its monuments. When a church father compares Babel and Pentecost, he is using the story to think about what kind of unity is worth longing for. All of this begins with those few sentences in Genesis 11. They are the seed. The growth that follows, through Jubilees, Josephus, Midrash, and early Christian reflection, shows how fertile that seed was. The city and the tower, the scattered languages, and the lingering questions would continue to fascinate artists and scholars long after the last bricks of Babylon had melted back into the plain. On a winter morning in a medieval church, long before electric light or printed Bibles, the Tower of Babel came to life not on a page, but on stone and plaster. Imagine a parish somewhere in France or Germany. The congregation stands in a nave lined with flickering candles. Most of the people cannot read. To them, the Bible is something they hear and something they see. High above, in the half-light near the chancel arch, a painted scene shows men straining under the weight of bricks, ladders reaching toward a half-built tower, and at the top, a small figure of God descending in a cloud. The priest explains that this is the story of Babel, the moment when human pride grew too tall and God scattered languages. For these listeners, that image, fixed beside scenes of Eden and the Last Judgment, becomes the way the story lodges in memory. For many centuries, the Tower of Babel lived in such pictures. In illuminated manuscripts copied by monks, it appears as a delicate miniature. Scribes painted tiny masons at work, sometimes in medieval tunics and hats, rather than ancient robes. The tower itself usually looks suspiciously like contemporary architecture. Instead of a Mesopotamian ziggurat, it resembles a narrow church tower or a round donjon. Artists were not trying to recreate Babylon accurately. They were using familiar forms to make a moral point. The tower is busy, full of scaffolding, yet plainly unstable. It leans slightly, or the courses of stone do not quite match. The lesson is visual. Projects born of pride look impressive for a time, but contain the seeds of their own collapse. This way of seeing Babel was shaped by the religious imagination of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Church fathers had already framed the story as a warning about the city built on self-love. Augustine, writing in North Africa in the 5th century, spoke of a society organized around the desire to dominate, in contrast to a community organized around the love of God. Later, theologians and preachers picked up this contrast and looked for ways to communicate it to ordinary people. The tower was a perfect symbol. It reached up, but for the wrong reasons. It drew people together, but in obedience to the wrong voice. At the same time, Europe was busy building its own towers. From the 11th century onward, cathedrals rose over market squares, their spires and bell towers piercing the sky. Italian cities competed to erect the tallest campanile. Northern towns lined their skylines with steeples. These were not presented as acts of defiance. They were meant to honor God, to call the faithful to prayer, to show the wealth and devotion of the community. Yet the resemblance to Babel was hard to miss. Here too, human beings marshaled great numbers of workers, hewed stone, hauled timber and copper, and poured resources into vertical monuments. Medieval artists sometimes played with this tension. In a carved capital on a church column, you might see a mason at Babel standing on a ladder that looks suspiciously like the ladder used by real stonecutters on the same building. On the next capital, an image of a bishop blesses a partly finished church. The two scenes balance each other. One shows building as a form of rebellion, the other as an act of worship. The stone itself becomes a quiet commentary about intent. A tower is not condemned merely for its height. It is judged by the spirit that animates it. In manuscripts, the range of Babel images grows wider over time. In some early examples, the tower is slender and square, like a simple watchtower. Later, artists begin to imagine it as a great round structure with many levels, each with a row of arches. The workers at the lower levels are larger and more carefully drawn, their faces expressive. At the upper levels, they shrink into little smudges of color, a hint of the dizzying scale. Sometimes, at the moment when God confuses their tongues, the scene becomes almost comic. Men gesticulate wildly, pointing in different directions. Mouths open in speech, but clearly unable to agree on where the next stone should go. The moral is serious, but the human confusion has a touch of satire. While parishioners gazed at these images, scholars and monks were wrestling with Babel in a different way. For them, the story raised questions about language and unity that went beyond a single tower. Many believed that humanity had once spoken a pure, original tongue. For Christian writers, that tongue was usually thought to be Hebrew, the language of the scriptures they revered. A learned bishop such as Isidore of Seville in the early Middle Ages would explain that after Babel the one language split into many, but that Hebrew continued among the people of Israel. Latin, Greek, and the various vernaculars were seen as younger branches, scarred by the confusion. This was not a scientific claim so much as a theological intuition. The Word of God, in their minds, should have a special stability. These beliefs had consequences for how people viewed linguistic diversity. On one hand, multiple languages were seen as a mark of division, a kind of wound in the body of humanity. On the other hand, the need to translate scripture and preach in local tongues forced the church to treat those languages with respect. When missionaries to the Germanic or Slavic peoples wrestled with unfamiliar sounds and invented alphabets, they were, in a way, working within the long shadow of Babel. The story that had once seemed only a curse became also a spur to creativity. By the later Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, the Tower of Babel began to attract a new kind of attention. Artists in the Low Countries, where trade, urban life, and religious debate were intense, turned again and again to Babel as a subject. None did so with more enduring influence than Peter Bruegel the Elder in the 16th century. Bruegel painted at least two major versions of the tower. In one, a huge circular structure looms over a busy harbor city. The tower is not smooth and gleaming. Its sides are honeycombed with arches and half-completed galleries. Some levels are finished, others are still under construction. Tiny figures swarm across ramps and scaffolds, carrying stones, pushing carts, leaning on tools. At the bottom left, a local ruler, sometimes identified as Nimrod, inspects the work while workers kneel. The more one looks, the more Bruegel's painting reveals. The tower's design is based not on a Mesopotamian ziggurat, but on a Roman amphitheater, especially the Colosseum. By choosing that model, Bruegel evokes the grandeur and decay of the Roman Empire, a power that once seemed unshakable but now lies in ruins. The tower appears to be crumbling even as it rises. Some arches do not align. Parts of the external wall rest on shaky foundations. The hill on which the structure stands looks cut and hacked, as if nature has been brutally reshaped. Above, small clouds drift past the upper stories, emphasizing the absurd scale. The entire composition is a meditation on the fragility of human projects, especially imperial ones. Bruegel painted in a world dominated by the Habsburg dynasty, whose rulers claimed vast territories and sought to impose uniform control over diverse peoples. It is not difficult to see his Babel as a veiled comment on such ambitions. The city at the base of the tower looks like a busy Netherlandish port, not an ancient Oriental town. The workers look like contemporary laborers. The image says, in effect, that Babel is not just a story about distant Mesopotamia. It is a pattern that repeats whenever political or religious elites attempt to build structures that disregard the diverse lives of ordinary people. Bruegel was not alone. Other artists in his region produced their own Babel scenes, each with different emphases. Some made the tower slimmer and more elegant. Others piled on the disorder, with collapsing scaffolds and tumbling stones. These paintings hung in the homes of merchants and magistrates, who would have seen in them both a reminder of biblical teaching and a sly commentary on the risks of their own age. To sit in a dining room with a Babel painting over the fireplace was to invite conversation about ambition, faith, and the uses of power. The story also continued to circulate in written form, woven into sermons, moral tales, and poems. Preachers used Babel as an example of what happens when a community makes its security an absolute value. The builders in Genesis fear being scattered. They refuse the divine instruction to fill the earth. For a congregation in a European town, the message might come through like this: if we cling too tightly to our own comfort, if we value our status more than justice, we may end up trapped in our own tower, unable to hear each other at all. At the same time, the tower became a way to think about the divisions within Christianity itself. After the Reformation, when new Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church faced one another across Europe, each side occasionally described the other as a kind of Babel. Catholic polemicists could point to the variety of Protestant doctrines and say, "Here is confusion, a scattering of belief." Protestants, on the other hand, sometimes portrayed the institutional church centered in Rome as a proud tower, elaborating traditions and structures that reached above the simple teaching of the Bible. The word Babel and its twin Babylon became charged symbols in this struggle. A city on 7 hills could be praised as the center of Christendom or denounced as a new Babylon, depending on who was speaking. Literature absorbed these resonances. Dante, writing in the early 14th century before the Reformation, but well acquainted with the tensions of his time, placed Nimrod, the mythic builder of Babel, in the lowest regions of his inferno. There the giant stands among other symbols of rebellious pride, unable to speak any coherent language. Dante gives him a string of mostly meaningless sounds. The image is cruel but effective. The great organizer of a unified people is reduced to Babel, a pitiable monument to the failure of his project. Later, poets and writers returned to the tower as a metaphor for various human frailties. John Milton, in his reflection on creation and fall, evokes Babel as one of the great turning points when humanity chose self-glory over obedience. English sermons of the 17th century sometimes paired Babel with the building of Solomon's temple, inviting hearers to note the difference between a house raised for the divine presence and a structure raised for human pride. The same materials are used, stone and wood and labor, but the intention and the outcome diverge. Through all this, artists and theologians kept circling back to the question of language. The Babel story dramatizes the moment when mutual understanding breaks down. In a world where Latin had long served as a common language of scholarship and church life, the rise of vernacular literatures and national cultures could feel like a new scattering. Was this a blessing, allowing the faith to be expressed in many voices, or a danger, leading to fragmentation? The answer depended on whom you asked. Reformers who translated the Bible into German or English saw their work as a kind of reversal of Babel within their own lands, restoring a clear word to people whose ears had been dulled by ritual words they did not understand. More conservative voices worried that once every tongue asserted its own authority, unity would become impossible. When printing spread across Europe, images of the tower could travel as woodcuts and engravings. Cheap illustrated Bibles and devotional books carried a standard set of pictures, among them a diagram-like view of Babel. Now even households far from great churches and galleries could contemplate the tower. With each reproduction, small variations crept in. Sometimes the tower was labeled simply Babel. Sometimes the artist added a caption about pride or punishment. In some cases, the workers are shown at the exact moment when they discover their speech has changed. Tools paused in mid-air, faces twisted in sudden frustration. By the time the early modern period gave way to the age of scientific exploration and Enlightenment thought, the story of Babel had entered new debates. Philosophers and speculative historians still told the tale, but some began to treat it more as an allegory than as a literal account. They saw in it a reflection of the observation that empires rise and fall, that languages split and evolve, that attempts to impose a single cultural pattern usually end badly. For a skeptical thinker like Voltaire, Babel could be a convenient way to poke fun at religious pride without going into details about bricks and towers. The image of workers shouting across a construction site and getting their words tangled was vivid enough to be repurposed as a comment on political assemblies or academies. At the same time, scholars who were painstakingly comparing languages noticed that the actual history of speech was more complex than the neat division into 70 or 72 tongues envisaged by earlier theologians. They found that some languages spoken in distant places had deep structural kinship. They traced families of languages such as the Indo-European group and the Semitic group. The story of Babel did not disappear, but it was gradually nudged from center stage in learned discussions. Instead of a single moment of confusion, historians of language now spoke of migrations, contacts, and slow changes. Yet even they could rarely resist using the word Babel as a shorthand for the bewildering variety they studied. In more popular culture, the tower remained a potent emblem. Writers in the 19th century, watching the rise of industrial cities, sometimes described the new factory skylines as modern Babels. Chimneys belching smoke took the place of ancient brick towers. Urban noise took the place of the cacophony of foreign tongues. The sense that humanity was again building structures beyond its moral capacity lingered. To live in London or New York or any growing metropolis was to feel both awe and anxiety at the crowded streets and rising buildings. The old story of people saying, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city," felt newly relevant. Even the word Babel, meaning confused sound, acquired a life of its own. Etymologists argue about the exact roots of the term, but in the popular mind, it linked naturally with Babel. A group of people all talking at once became a Babel of voices. A complicated international conference where translators struggled to keep up could be described as a diplomatic Babel. The biblical city had become not just a place in an ancient narrative, but a pattern of experience repeated in offices, markets, and parliaments. So across the centuries, the Tower of Babel has stood, not as a single remembered building, but as an idea that different ages have shaped to their own concerns. For medieval craftsmen carving in stone, it was a warning about projects that forget the value of individual lives. For Renaissance painters, it became a way to reflect on imperial power and the fragility of human achievement. For preachers, it remained a story about pride and trust. For modern writers and artists, it offered a frame in which to think about cities, technology, and the challenge of living together in a world of many voices. In every case, the same elements recur. A city that draws people in, a monument that promises security or greatness, a moment when communication breaks down, and behind it all, the suggestion that there is a difference between unity rooted in justice and mercy, and unity imposed by fear. The Tower of Babel, seen through the art and faith of those who inherited it, continually asks which kind of unity we are chasing when we begin to build. If you walked into a European study in the 16th century, you might find a scholar bent over a heavy Bible, with a quill in his hand, trying to map the entire human family on a single sheet of parchment. He would draw lines from Noah to his sons, then to the nations listed in Genesis, and finally to the peoples he knew from classical geography and travelers' reports. Somewhere on that page, like a hairline crack through the middle, ran the story of Babel. For him, it was not a metaphor. It was the moment when human speech fractured and every later tongue on earth was born. For a very long time, that was how educated people in the West explained languages. Babel was the Big Bang of linguistics. The idea seemed to make sense for several reasons. First, it sat firmly inside Scripture. which many regarded as a reliable historical record. Second, it matched the everyday experience of confusion. Anyone who had tried to bargain with a merchant in a foreign port or negotiate with a distant ally knew just how hard it was when you did not share words. If there was a God who had made the world, it seemed natural that he might have a story to tell about why people could not understand one another. Medieval thinkers tried to arrange the chaos under a kind of order. Many taught that there had once been a single sacred language. For Christian scholars, that language was usually Hebrew, the tongue of the Old Testament. In their telling, Hebrew had been the speech of Eden and of Noah. At Babel, other tongues were created as a judgment, but Hebrew continued among the descendants of Shem and became the special inheritance of Israel. When the Church later turned to Latin and Greek, these were seen as younger branches grafted onto the older tree. This was less a scientific hypothesis than a theological instinct. There had to be an original word that was closest to the divine. Not everyone agreed. Augustine, who thought deeply about language, suspected that even Adamic speech may have changed after the fall, and that the story of Babel must be read more for its meaning than its mechanics. Later, Dante wrestled with the question of the first language in his philosophical treatise on vernacular speech. He considered the idea that Hebrew had been preserved intact, but he also saw that languages clearly altered over time and that new forms arose. He imagined the builders of the tower as men who presumed that they could hold history still, that the language they spoke would never slip from their grasp. In Dante's imagination, the punishment was not only that their words changed, but that they found themselves locked inside sounds that no one else understood. By the time the Renaissance arrived, the appetite for more exact answers had grown, and with it a wave of strange claims. Proud nations wanted their own tongue to have been the one spoken in Eden. Scottish writers suggested that Gaelic was the oldest of all languages. Swedish scholars claimed that their speech was the mother of every other European tongue. There were proposals for Egyptian, Dutch, and several others. Each claim came with elaborate arguments, snatches of etymology, and appeals to old chronicles. Behind the learned disputes stood an unspoken desire. If one could prove that one's own language was original, then perhaps one's own people had a privileged place in the story of the world. Babel became a contest ground. During the same centuries, missionaries and traders were bringing news of languages far beyond the old Mediterranean world. Reports from the Americas, from Africa, and from Asia described vocabularies and grammars that did not fit easily into the neat lists of 70 or 72 tongues that earlier scholars had derived from Genesis. The sheer variety of sound systems and word orders began to strain the old framework. It was harder and harder to imagine a single moment when every one of these had split off like shards from a broken pot. Still, the story of Babel remained in the background as a kind of moral tale. It was used to warn against human pride or to explain why preaching the gospel required so much translation. The real shift came in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when a new way of studying language took shape. In a lecture in Calcutta in 1786, an English judge named William Jones remarked on the striking similarities between Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, and classical Greek and Latin. The verbs and nouns, he observed, were so alike that no philologer could examine them all three without believing that they had sprung from some common source which perhaps no longer existed. This was not the first time anyone had noticed such resemblances. But Jones put the observation in a clear and influential form. From that remark grew the discipline we now call comparative linguistics. Scholars such as Franz Bopp, Rasmus Rask, and Jacob Grimm began to compare long lists of words from different languages, not in a casual way, but with an eye to regular sound correspondences. They noticed, for example, that a consonant in one language would reliably shift in another, that certain patterns repeated across many tongues. From these patterns, they inferred a family of related languages that stretched from India to Ireland, which they called Indo-European. Hebrew and Arabic formed another family, later known as Semitic. Many other families were slowly identified. This work did something that the story of Babel had not attempted. It treated languages as historical organisms, changing gradually over centuries through contact, conquest, migration, and internal drift. There was no need for a single moment when all tongues were suddenly scrambled. The Babel heard in ports and markets could be explained by long chains of natural development. The picture that emerged was in some ways more intricate and beautiful than the old one. Words could be traced backward through daughter languages to earlier forms, sometimes reaching a hypothetical ancestral root, reconstructed with care and marked as such. For those who still took the Bible literally, this posed a problem. Some tried to reconcile the new science with the old story. Perhaps, they suggested, the event at Babel had created a handful of original languages, which then diversified further in the way linguists described. Others argued that the passage in Genesis should be read as a parable about the danger of imperial unity, rather than as a technical account of language history. A few rejected the new linguistics outright, but as evidence accumulated, the scholarly world increasingly treated Genesis 11 as an etiological myth, a story that explains human difference in symbolic terms rather than a field report from the early Mesopotamian construction industry. The rise of linguistics did not mean that the themes of Babel vanished. They shifted into new debates. 19th century Europe was obsessed with the relationship between language, nation, and race. Some thinkers fused the new language families with old ideas about blood and destiny. Indo-European speech was sometimes linked to claims about supposed superiority. Semitic languages were set over against this as an opposing category. In such schemes, Babel could be invoked either as the tragic moment when unity was lost, or as the blessed moment when certain groups were set apart. It was a dangerous mix of science and myth. Later generations would have to confront the damage done by those ideas. At the same time, the practical problem of many tongues remained. International trade and diplomacy struggled with the fact that no single language commanded universal consent. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, a few idealists decided to tackle this head-on by creating planned languages. The most famous of these is Esperanto, invented by a Polish-Jewish doctor named L.L. Zamenhof. Raised in a city where Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews all spoke their own languages and often mistrusted one another, he dreamed of a neutral second language that anyone could learn, a shared second tongue that would sit alongside native languages without replacing them. It was, in a sense, a gentle answer to Babel, an attempt at unity without erasing diversity. Modern neuroscience and cognitive science added yet another layer to the story. researchers began to study how children acquire language, how the brain processes grammar and meaning, and how much of our speech capacity is inherited. The discovery of genes that play a role in speech development, such as FOXP2, suggested that our ability to learn language rests on very old biological foundations. That ability emerged long before cities or towers. In that sense, the deepest unity of human speech lies not in a single original tongue, but in the shared wiring that lets a child in any culture soak up whatever language is spoken around them. Today, when linguists map languages on great branching trees and plot them on world maps with color-coded families, the story of Babel survives mostly in the margins. As a metaphor we reach for when meetings descend into confusion, or when the internet feels like a roaring crowd. The serious study of language no longer looks for a single event in Shinar. Instead, it finds beauty in the slow flow of sounds and structures across centuries. If there is a lesson that lingers from the old tale, it may be this. Attempts to force a single language or a single culture on everyone are bound to run against the deep grain of human history. Diversity of tongues, far from being a mere punishment, has become one of the richest sources of evidence about our past and one of the most intimate marks of who we are. If you step into a modern city at dusk, stand among glass towers and listen, you can hear a distant echo of Babel. It is there in the mix of voices drifting from a subway entrance, in menus printed in several languages, in the chatter of tourists trying to match words to street signs. The old story about a city, a tower, and a confusion of tongues was set on the plain of Shinar, but its themes have followed humanity into the age of jet travel, satellite signals, and instant translation. The shapes of the towers have changed. Their bricks are often steel and glass, their foundations servers rather than stone. Yet the questions remain remarkably familiar. How much unity do we want? How much diversity can we live with? What happens when communication fails at scale? By the start of the 20th century, the Tower of Babel had already become shorthand for any setting where languages pile up on top of one another. The newly created League of Nations in Geneva faced the practical problem of how to conduct debates among delegates who spoke French, English, Russian, and many other tongues. Translators sat with headphones and microphones, turning speeches into multiple streams of sound. The United Nations that followed in New York institutionalized this even further, with a whole corps of interpreters and official languages. To watch a session in the General Assembly is to see a carefully managed Babel, a place where the confusion is never entirely banished, but is kept at bay by technology and training. Writers and filmmakers quickly noticed the metaphorical power of that scene. The Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, with his taste for philosophical puzzles, imagined a library of Babel, a universe shaped like a vast library in which every possible book is present. In that space, meaning is drowned in the flood of letters. Most volumes are nonsense. A few contain truths, but no one can easily find them. The story has nothing to do with bricks and towers, yet the title tells us what he has in mind. A structure built in pursuit of total knowledge becomes a place where people wander, baffled, and often desperate. It is Babel as information rather than architecture. In a more playful register, Douglas Adams introduced the Babelfish in his comic science fiction tale about interstellar hitchhikers. "Slip the tiny creature into your ear," he wrote. and you would instantly understand any spoken language in the galaxy. It was a joke, but also a fantasy of undoing Babel, not through a return to one language, but by making every tongue transparent. Modern technology has taken cautious steps in that direction. Smartphone apps now allow travelers to point a camera at a menu and see translations appear on the screen, or to hold the device between two speakers and watch as it attempts to bridge their words. The results are often clumsy, sometimes hilarious, but the intent is clear. We are building devices to stand where in the old story, only divine intervention could stand. At the same time, there is a different kind of tower taking shape, one that few people ever see. Data centers filled with racks of machines quietly store and process the torrents of messages, pictures, and videos that pass through the internet every second. The network that links them circles the planet. It lets someone in Lagos talk in real time with someone in Seoul, or a teacher in Cairo share a lecture with students in Sao Paulo. This is a kind of global city without walls, a place where the old scattering of peoples has been partly reversed. Yet it is also noisy and often fragmented. Social media, that great marketplace of opinion, can feel like the construction yard of a new Babel, with voices shouting past each other, alliances forming and dissolving, mutual misunderstanding only a careless post away. Modern scholars of religion and culture have pointed out that the Babel story speaks in interesting ways to this digital condition. In Genesis, the problem is not the desire to connect, but the insistence on one project, one center, one name. The builders want to secure themselves against loss by concentrating everyone in a single place. The scattering that follows can be read not only as punishment but as a release, a return to a more varied and open world. In our own time, we see both impulses at work. Some forces push toward homogenization, global brands, global platforms, and the spread of one dominant language in business and science all suggest a move back towards something like a single speech. Other forces push the other way. Local cultures assert themselves. Minority languages find new life online, where speakers separated by oceans can encourage one another. The fate of languages is one of the most striking arenas where the old myth and current reality intersect. Linguists estimate that thousands of languages are spoken today, but that many of them are fragile, with only a few hundred or a few dozen speakers. When a language falls silent, the stories, idioms, and rhythms it carries vanish as well. For communities facing this loss, the story of Babel can feel bittersweet. It tells them that multiplicity of tongues is ancient and meaningful, not an accident. It also reminds them how easily powerful cultures can sweep aside weaker ones in the name of unity or progress. Efforts to document and revive endangered languages, to teach them in schools and use them in public life, are in a sense acts of resistance against a new Babel, not of confusion, but of forgetfulness. In politics, the tower still stands as a warning. Commentators reach for it when they describe grand schemes that ignore local realities, whether those are economic unions, massive infrastructure projects, or ambitious social programs. The image of a project that rises impressively and then stalls because the participants no longer understand one another is too apt to leave alone. Some critics of globalization have invoked Babel to suggest that a world economy knit together without adequate shared norms or institutions may prove unstable, impressive from a distance, but riddled with cracks. Others use the story to argue for humility in foreign policy. Nations that seek to reshape entire regions according to their own image can find themselves trapped in conflicts they never fully grasp, speaking past the very people they hope to influence. The arts continue to mine the tower for new meanings. A film titled Babel interweaves stories set in Morocco, Japan, Mexico, and the United States, linked by a single gun and by misunderstandings across cultural and linguistic lines. The narrative makes no attempt to retell Genesis, but the title signals its concern. In a world where everything is connected, miscommunication can still be deadly. Pain ripples along unseen threads. Likewise, contemporary painters and novelists have depicted Babel as a skyscraper, a corporate headquarters, a cluster of satellites in orbit. Each version asks who is planning the project, who is doing the lifting, and who will bear the cost when the structure trembles. For people of faith, the story remains a live text. Some see in it a call to respect cultural and linguistic difference as something more than a temporary inconvenience. Others read it together with later passages that describe a time when people of many nations bring their own languages and gifts into a shared worship without erasing what makes them distinct. Even for those who do not accept its theological claims, Babel offers a compact and memorable way to talk about a perennial human problem. We long for connection, but we build systems that can easily turn into machines of control, and we speak to each other through clouds of assumption that distort our words. Stand again in that modern city at dusk and watch the lights come on in the towers. Behind some windows, people are coding translation software. Behind others, they are drafting international agreements or crafting films and novels. In street-level cafes, conversations switch fluidly between languages. The world is louder and more interconnected than anything the builders on the plain of Shinar could have imagined. Yet their story still reaches us. It asks whether the towers we raise today, visible or invisible, are being built to make a name for ourselves alone, or to create a world in which many voices can speak without fear.